Home is supposed to be the safest place in the world. The person you share it with is supposed to be the person you trust most. That is the basic assumption most people carry through their lives without ever questioning it, because for most people, it holds true. But for the women in this case, home was where the danger lived. The man they trusted was the threat. And the system designed to protect them, the police officers who attended, the pathologists who examined, the coroners who recorded, the complaints bodies who reviewed, chose at every single turn to look the other way. This is the case of Susan Nicholson, a 52-year-old mother of two who was murdered by her partner, Robert Trigg, in Worthing in 2011. It is also the case of Caroline Develin, who Trigg killed 5 years earlier in the same town. And it is the case of a police force that had every piece of information it needed to stop him, and did not. Section 1. Who Susan Nicholson was. Susan Nicholson was 52 years old, a mother of 2 sons, and a former employee of Coutts, one of Britain's most prestigious private banks. She had built a career in London, raised her boys, and eventually moved to a job closer to home to be near them. Her sons Joe and Mark later described her as a force to be reckoned with, full of energy and life. They said their childhoods were packed with activities and hobbies because of her. She coached them, pushed them, showed up for them. She was not a woman on the margins. She was not invisible. She was exactly the kind of person the system should have been able to protect. By 2010, Susan was living in a flat on Rowlands Road in Worthing, West Sussex. Worthing is a quiet coastal town, the kind of place where people know their neighbours, where the same faces appear in the same shops week after week. Susan knew her neighbours. One of them, a woman named Hannah Cooper, would later become one of the most important witnesses in the entire case, because Hannah could see and hear what was happening inside that flat, and she kept calling the police about it. But that comes later. In July 2010, Susan attended an alcohol rehabilitation centre in Worthing. That is where she met Robert Trigg. They were both patients. They began spending time together during their treatment, and by November 2010, they were in a relationship. The following month, December 2010, Trigg moved into Susan's flat on Rowlands Road. To her sons, he seemed like a bit of an idiot, but nothing more than that. They had no idea what was really going on. They had no idea what their mother was living with behind closed doors. And crucially, neither did Susan have any idea about the man she had let move in, because the people who held that information, Sussex Police, never told her. What Susan did not know was that Robert Trigg had spent the better part of a decade hurting women. He had a documented, recorded, on-file history of violence that stretched back to at least 2002. Multiple women, multiple incidents, multiple police call-outs, cautions, and even a criminal conviction. All of it sitting in police files. None of it ever used to warn Susan or to flag Trigg as a dangerous man when officers started being called to her address just weeks after he moved in. Within months of Trigg moving in, neighbour Hannah Cooper began seeing Susan with injuries. Cooper contacted police to report fights on 4 separate occasions. She could see what was happening from next door. She made the calls. She did exactly what anyone is told to do when they suspect someone is being hurt. She picked up the phone and reported it, repeatedly, to the people whose job it is to intervene. And still, on April 17, 2011, less than 5 months after Trigg moved into her home, Susan Nicholson was found dead on her sofa. Trigg was in the flat. He did not call an ambulance. Instead, he called Hannah Cooper and told her he thought Susan was dead. Then he left the flat and walked to a nearby shop to buy cigarettes. He phoned his brother. Then Hannah Cooper called 999. Police attended Susan's flat and did not treat Trigg as a suspect. They treated him as a significant witness. A bereaved partner who had woken to find the woman he lived with unresponsive on the sofa. Trigg told them he must have accidentally rolled on top of her in his sleep, inadvertently smothering her. Later that year, in December 2011, the coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death. The case was closed. Susan's sons had lost their mother and were being told it was a tragic accident. Her parents, Peter and Elizabeth Skelton, were told the same thing. They did not believe it. They would spend the next 6 years and every penny of their savings proving that it was not. What makes this case more than a straightforward domestic violence failure, as horrifying as those cases already are, is the layer underneath it. Before Susan ever met Robert Trigg, before she ever attended that rehabilitation centre and sat across from the man who would kill her, Sussex police held records of 7 separate reports made by 4 different women about Trigg's violence. 7 reports, 4 women, going back to 2002. Those records documented brutal physical assaults, threats to kill, threatening phone calls, and property destruction. One woman had spent 3 weeks in hospital after Trigg attacked her. Another had told police he threatened to kill her and that his behaviour was violent and delusional. And 4 years before Susan's death, in 2006, another woman who had been in a relationship with Robert Trigg was found dead in her home in Worthing. Her name was Caroline Develin. She was 35 years old and had 4 children. Sussex police attended that scene too. They ruled her death non-suspicious. They recorded it as natural causes. They never opened an inquest. They never investigated Trigg. They filed it away and moved on. 2 women, the same man, the same town, the same police force, the same conclusion. Nothing to see here. By the time Susan Nicholson met Robert Trigg in that rehabilitation centre in July 2010, he had already killed once, been reported for violence by multiple women across nearly a decade, and walked away from all of it without ever being seriously investigated. Susan had no way of knowing any of that. She trusted the relationship. She let him move in. And 4.5 months later, she was dead on her sofa, while he went out to buy cigarettes. The question of how that was allowed to happen starts not in April 2011, when Susan died, but years earlier, with the women who came before her, and the records that should have stopped Robert Trigg long before he ever knocked on her door. Section 2. Robert Trigg's documented history of violence. Before Susan, Robert Trigg had been hurting women for years before he ever met Susan Nicholson, and the police knew it. His first long-term relationship was with a woman named Rebecca Alcorn. They were together for nearly a decade. That relationship ended in 2002, and it ended because of his drinking and his violent outbursts. They had a daughter together. When Rebecca ended things, Trigg moved on quickly. He started seeing a woman named Susan Holland. That relationship followed the same pattern almost immediately. Trigg drank heavily, and when he drank, he became dangerous. Arguments escalated into violence. Holland tried to manage it, tried to stay, and then one night in 2003, it went further than it had ever gone before. Trigg accused Susan Holland of sleeping with a neighbour. There was no evidence of it. It did not matter. He beat her. He kicked her in the head. He kicked her in the face. The attack was so severe, and perhaps so frightening even to Trigg himself, that he did something unusual afterwards. He called the police on himself. He told the officer on the phone, "I am going to kill her. You need to arrest me." Susan Holland was taken to hospital. She stayed there for 3 weeks. The injuries required that level of care. Trigg was later convicted of assault in connection with that attack. That conviction should have been the clearest possible signal about who Robert Trigg was. A man who beat a woman badly enough to hospitalise her for 3 weeks, who called police to warn them he might kill her, who was convicted of the assault. It is all there. It is all on record. And it was just the beginning. Between 2003 and 2005, police were called 5 separate times to incidents involving Trigg and Susan Holland. 5 call-outs over roughly 2 years. Each one documenting violence, or the threat of it, by the same man against the same woman. Holland eventually got out of the relationship, as Rebecca Alcorn had before her. Trigg then moved on to other women. Between 2006 and 2010, police were called on another 5 occasions in connection with Trigg's violent behaviour towards 2 further partners. That brings the total to 10 police call-outs involving Robert Trigg and the women in his life, spread across several years before he ever set foot in Susan Nicholson's flat. One of those women told police that Trigg had threatened to kill her. She described his behaviour as violent and delusional. She gave that information to officers. It went into a file. Another former partner was taken to hospital after Trigg attacked her. That too was recorded. By the time Robert Trigg walked into the Alcohol Rehabilitation Centre in Worthing in 2010 and introduced himself to Susan Nicholson, Sussex police held records of 7 reports made by 4 different women about his violence, going all the way back to 2003. Those records covered physical assaults, death threats, threatening phone calls, and smashing windows. Not one incident, not 2, 7 documented reports across 4 separate victims. This matters for a reason that goes beyond simply establishing what kind of man Trigg was. It matters because of a legal tool that existed in the United Kingdom specifically designed to address situations like this one. Clare's Law, formerly known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, gives members of the public the right to ask police whether a current or former partner has a history of domestic violence. It also gives police the power to proactively disclose that information when they believe someone is at risk. The scheme was named after Claire Wood, a woman murdered by a man with a history of violence against women. The entire purpose of the scheme is to prevent exactly what happened to Susan Nicholson. Whether a formal disclosure under Clare's Law could have saved Susan is a complicated question given the timing of when the scheme was introduced nationally. But the principle it represents is simple. If police hold information showing a man is dangerous to the women he lives with, there is an argument they have a duty to act on that information when that man starts a new relationship. Sussex police had a file on Robert Trigg going back years. They had reports from 4 different women. They had a criminal conviction for a brutal assault. They had call-outs documented in their own system. And when Susan Nicholson started being beaten in her flat on Rowlands Road, officers attended those call-outs without ever connecting what they were seeing to everything already sitting in their records about the man standing in front of them. There is one more piece of Trigg's history that belongs in this section, not because it happened to a different woman, but because it happened in the same town. 4 years before Susan died, and involved the same police force making the same decisions. In 2006, a woman named Caroline Develin was found dead in her home in Worthing. She had been in a relationship with Robert Trigg. Police attended. They ruled it non-suspicious. They recorded it as natural causes and closed the case. At least 2 of the officers who had been involved in that investigation were later involved in responding to call-outs at Susan Nicholson's address. The same officers, the same man, 4 years apart. And still, no one joined the dots. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Trigg's history of violence was not hidden. It was not buried in a database no one could access. It was there, documented, in the files of the force that kept sending officers to Susan's door. What those officers did and did not do with that information in the weeks before she died is the next part of this story. Section 3. The death of Caroline Develin, the murder police called natural causes. On the morning of March 26, 2006, one of Caroline Develin's children woke up and went to find their mother. It was Mother's Day. The child was 10 years old. Caroline was in her bedroom at the house on Cranworth Road in Worthing. She was not asleep. She was dead. Her body was found in an unusual position, kneeling, with her head at the foot end of the bed. Robert Trigg was in the house. He told police he had found Caroline unresponsive. He had not called an ambulance. He had left that to her children. Caroline Develin was 35 years old. She was Scottish, originally from Ayrshire, and had 4 children. People who knew her described her as cheerful and happy, someone with a spark about her. But in the time she had been with Trigg, people close to her had noticed a change. She had become withdrawn. She had lost that spark. Her niece, Zoe Watson, had seen Trigg be violent towards Caroline directly and had asked her about it. Caroline's response was straightforward. He has done it before, and he will do it again. At some point before her death, Caroline had been talking about her upcoming 40th birthday. She made a comment that the people around her would not forget. She said, "I won't make my 40th. She was right. Robert Trigg killed her before she ever turned 36. Neighbours who lived near the couple on Cranworth Road described their relationship as volatile. They said Trigg had angry outbursts when he was drunk, which was often. The night before Caroline's body was found, neighbours had heard what they described as rough and loud sounds coming from the bedroom. The following morning, she was dead, and the man who had been in that bedroom with her was telling police it was a tragedy he could not explain. Sussex police attended and made a decision quickly. The death was ruled non-suspicious. A post-mortem examination was carried out by a local pathologist in Worthing. The conclusion was that Caroline had died of natural causes, specifically a brain aneurysm. No inquest was opened, no further investigation was launched. The case was closed. What happened behind the scenes in the decision to conduct that post-mortem is one of the most quietly damning details of the entire case. The local pathologist in Worthing had concerns. The circumstances of Caroline's death were unexplained. She was only 35. The position in which her body was found was unusual. The pathologist wanted a Home Office forensic pathologist to conduct a more thorough examination. A Home Office pathologist is a senior specialist, the kind brought in specifically for cases where the cause of death is not clear. Sussex police refused to pay for one. The reason given, as it later emerged, was that they only wanted a routine examination. It was, in the words of Caroline's family, a budget-based decision. The cheaper post-mortem went ahead. The Home Office pathologist was never called. And the neck injuries that pointed to suffocation, the injuries that were there in the body the whole time, were not identified. There was also a documented state of distrust between the county pathologist and Sussex police at the time, connected to previous disagreements about requests for specialist examinations in unexplained death cases. The pathologist who examined Caroline was the same pathologist who had previously clashed with the force over these kinds of requests. Sussex Police's refusal to fund a proper examination did not happen in a vacuum. It happened against a backdrop of institutional resistance to spending money on thorough investigations into deaths that officers had already decided, before the science was complete, were not suspicious. Caroline's family did not accept the conclusion. Her mother went to Worthing Police Station to raise concerns about Trigg. A detective met her in the reception area. Not in a private room, not in an office. In the reception area, within earshot of other members of the public who were waiting nearby. The detective spoke to her in what the family described as a patronising and dismissive way. The message was clear. They were not going to be taken seriously. Caroline's sister Anne said later that it was obvious the police had no intention of listening to them, and that the detective made their mother feel stupid and like an inconvenience. The family's concerns about Trigg were specific. They were not vague unease or grief looking for somewhere to land. They had seen how he behaved. They knew the relationship had been volatile. They knew Caroline had changed while she was with him. They had a 10-year-old child who had walked in to find their mother dead while Trigg was in the house. A man who had not called for an ambulance, who had instead left that task to Caroline's children. None of that was enough for Sussex police to look twice. Trigg was not questioned as a suspect. He was not investigated. He was treated as a bereaved partner and left alone. He continued to live in Worthing. He continued to meet women. He continued to drink and to rage and to hurt the people around him. In the years between Caroline's death in 2006 and his meeting Susan Nicholson in 2010, police were called 5 more times in connection with his violent behaviour towards 2 further partners. Every single one of those call-outs was another opportunity to look at the full picture of who Robert Trigg was. Every single one was missed. It was not until 2015, 9 years after Caroline Develin died on Mother's Day, that an independent pathologist finally reviewed the original post-mortem findings. Dr. Nathaniel Carey one of Britain's most senior forensic pathologists and a figure involved in the Hillsborough inquiry, examined the evidence. He found that Caroline had died as a result of a blow to the back of the head. The neck injuries were there. They had been there all along. The cause of death was not a brain aneurysm. It was not natural causes. It was Robert Trigg. The 6 call-outs to Susan Nicholson's flat did not happen in isolation. They happened against the backdrop of everything in this section: a previous unexplained death, a documented history of violence, and a police force that had already shown 4 years earlier exactly how it handled women who came to harm around Robert Trigg. Section 4. The 6 call-outs to Susan's flat, each one a missed chance. Robert Trigg moved into Susan Nicholson's flat on Rowlands Road in December 2010. By April 2011, Susan was dead. In the roughly 4 months between those 2 dates, Sussex police were called to that address 6 times because of reports of violence. 6 visits to the same address involving the same man in under 4 months. Each one was treated as a standalone incident. Each one was logged, attended and closed, without anyone stepping back to look at the pattern forming in front of them. The first call came approximately 3 months before Susan's death. A neighbour reported loud shouting and screaming coming from the flat. It had been going on for around 2 hours. Officers attended. They noted the disturbance. They did not pull up Robert Trigg's history on their system, or, if they did not act on what they found there. They did not contact the Specialist Domestic Violence Unit. They did not flag the call for follow-up. They attended, they noted it, and they left. More calls followed in the weeks after that. The pattern the neighbours could hear through the walls, the arguments, the sounds of violence, the sudden silences, was being reported to police each time it became impossible to ignore. Neighbour Hannah Cooper contacted police on 4 separate occasions after seeing Susan with injuries and witnessing the fighting firsthand. Cooper was not making vague noise complaints. She was reporting a woman she could see was being hurt, repeatedly, by the man living in her home. Then, in the month before Susan's death, a neighbour reported that Trigg had punched Susan directly in the face. Officers attended that call too. They spoke to the parties involved. The incident was logged. Trigg was not arrested. No immediate protective action was taken. 2 days after that report, another neighbour called police again, this time reporting an argument that had been going on for the good part of the entire day. When officers arrived at the flat on that occasion, they found Susan Nicholson with 2 black eyes, a swollen nose and mouth, bruising across her chest, and a cut to her arm. Those injuries were not ambiguous. 2 black eyes, a swollen nose and mouth, chest bruising, a cut to the arm. On a woman whose address police had now attended multiple times in a matter of weeks. A woman living with a man who had a criminal conviction for assault, who had hospitalised a previous partner for 3 weeks, who had been the subject of 7 reports made by 4 different women, and who had been present when a previous girlfriend died unexpectedly in her own home 4 years earlier in the same town. Trigg was given a formal caution for that assault. A caution is not an arrest. It is not a charge. It is not a prosecution. It is the lowest possible formal response available to police. A recorded acknowledgement that something happened, signed by the offender, with no court appearance, no trial, no sentence. For punching a woman in the face badly enough to give her 2 black eyes and a swollen nose, in the context of a pattern of escalating violence at the same address over multiple weeks, Robert Trigg received a caution. The caution was also not linked to the previous call-outs at the same address. The incidents were being processed as separate, disconnected events, rather than as what they clearly were, a sustained campaign of violence by one man against one woman in one home. A formal risk assessment was carried out after the visit, where Susan's injuries were recorded. Her risk level was graded as medium. Under the procedures in place at the time, a medium risk grading should have triggered a referral to Sussex Police's Specialist Domestic Violence Unit, a team specifically trained to handle exactly these kinds of cases. That referral never happened. The risk grading was quietly downgraded from medium to standard, with no reason recorded for the change. No explanation was ever given for why. The specialist unit was never contacted. No one with specific training in domestic violence escalation ever looked at Susan Nicholson's case. The significance of that downgrade is hard to overstate. The system that existed, imperfect as it was, had identified Susan as being at medium risk. The process that was supposed to follow from that identification was clear. Someone made a decision to change that grading and close the referral pathway, and whoever made that decision left no paperwork explaining why. The safety net that should have caught Susan at that point was quietly folded away. At the fresh inquest held in 2021, the jury heard that police had, in total, been called to 13 separate domestic abuse incidents involving Robert Trigg across his history with various partners. 13 documented call-outs. Of the 6 that related specifically to Susan's address in the months before her death, not one resulted in Trigg being arrested, charged, or referred to any specialist service. The officers who attended those call-outs were not connecting what they were seeing to the file Sussex police held on this man. A file that stretched back nearly a decade and included violence serious enough to put a woman in hospital for 3 weeks. There is a specific detail from the inquest testimony that sits particularly heavily when you consider everything that was known about Trigg at this point. At one of the early call-outs to Susan's flat, the one triggered by a neighbour reporting 2 hours of shouting and screaming, officers attended and made no note of Trigg's history of violence towards previous partners. It was not recorded in the log for that visit. The history was not checked. Or, if it was not considered relevant enough to write down. An officer attending a domestic disturbance call involving Robert Trigg did not note Robert Trigg's history of domestic violence. That absence of a few typed lines in a police log is one of the clearest illustrations of how Susan Nicholson fell through a system that should have held her. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 days after Trigg received that caution for punching Susan in the face and giving her 2 black eyes, Susan Nicholson was still living in that flat with him. What happened next, and how police responded when they were finally called there for the last time, is the part of this story that closes every remaining door. Section 5. The night Susan died. On April 17, 2011, Robert Trigg called his neighbour Hannah Cooper. He told her, "It's Sue. I think she's dead." He did not call 999. He did not call an ambulance. He made that call to Hannah Cooper, then he left the flat, walked to a nearby shop and bought cigarettes. After that, he phoned his older brother, Michael. Hannah Cooper was the one who called 999. The woman who had been reporting Susan's injuries to police for months, who had watched this situation deteriorate from next door, was the one who made the emergency call when it was finally too late. Susan Nicholson was found dead on the sofa in her flat on Rowlands Road in Worthing. She was 52 years old. The address was barely 2 miles from Cranworth Road, where Caroline Develin had been found dead in her bedroom 5 years earlier. Same town. Same man. Same behaviour in the immediate aftermath. No ambulance called. Trigg leaving others to deal with the discovery of a body while he went about his own business. When police arrived at the flat, Trigg gave them an explanation. He said that he and Susan had fallen asleep on the sofa together, and that at some point in the night he must have accidentally rolled on top of her, inadvertently smothering her in his sleep. He said he woke up and found her unresponsive. He had not called for help. He had instead phoned a neighbour and then gone out for cigarettes. That was the account Sussex police received. That was the account they accepted as their starting point. Trigg was not treated as a suspect. He was designated a significant witness, a bereaved partner who had suffered a terrible accident in the night. There were immediate details at the scene that warranted serious scrutiny. The sofa in Susan's flat was small. Trigg himself later estimated, during inquest proceedings, that the two of them had slept on that sofa together approximately 40 times. The claim that he had accidentally rolled onto her and smothered her without waking on a piece of furniture not designed for two people to sleep on was the foundation of his entire account. It was accepted without meaningful challenge in the immediate aftermath of Susan's death. Police did not treat the scene as a potential crime scene in the way that the circumstances demanded. They did not treat the man who had received a caution for punching the dead woman in the face just 2 days earlier as someone whose account required serious interrogation. A post-mortem examination was carried out. Sussex Police did not request a Home Office forensic pathologist, the same decision they had made 4 years earlier when Caroline Develin died. The examination concluded that Susan had died as a result of compression of the neck, consistent with Trigg's account of accidentally rolling onto her. The death was not treated as suspicious. Later that year, in December 2011, Coroner Michael Kendall held an inquest and recorded a verdict of accidental death. The official position of the state was that Susan Nicholson had died by misadventure, that her partner had inadvertently smothered her in his sleep, and that no crime had been committed. Trigg walked out of that process a free man. He had now been present for the deaths of 2 women in the same town 4 years apart. Both had been ruled non-suspicious. Both times he had failed to call an ambulance. Both times police had treated him as a witness rather than a suspect. And both times the women's families were left with verdicts they did not believe, told by every official body they approached that there was nothing more to investigate. Susan's sons, Joe and Mark, lost their mother and were handed an inquest verdict that told them it was an accident. Her parents, Peter and Elizabeth Skelton, were handed the same verdict. The Skeltons did not accept it. They began asking questions almost immediately. Peter Skelton went to Sussex Police in the period after Susan's death and raised concerns about the circumstances. He was told his queries were valid but not significant, and that they amounted to a matter of opinion. The investigation would not be reopened. The Skeltons were in their 80s. They had just lost their daughter. They were being told by police that their concerns were a matter of opinion. What the Skeltons did know, and what made them certain something was wrong, was the sofa. It was too small for 2 people to sleep on comfortably. They had seen it. The dimensions of it did not match the account Trigg was giving. They also knew, or were beginning to find out, pieces of Trigg's history that made his explanation feel impossible to accept. They did not yet know the full extent of what Sussex Police held in their files. They did not yet know about Caroline Develin, or the details of how that investigation had been handled. But they knew their daughter was dead. They knew the man she had been living with had been hitting her in the weeks before she died. And they knew that man's account of what happened did not sit right. After Susan's death, Trigg continued his life in Worthing. In October 2014, 3 years after killing Susan, he began a relationship with a woman named Deirdre Loveridge. When that relationship broke down, Trigg sent her more than 100 abusive messages and phone calls. Loveridge reported him to police. He was convicted of harassment and given a restraining order. A man who had killed 2 women and walked away from both deaths unconvicted was still out there, still in relationships, still being reported to police for abusive behaviour, still receiving the most minimal possible responses from the system. Meanwhile, the Skeltons were just beginning a fight that would take 6 years, cost them their life savings, and push them through every institution designed to hold police accountable, most of which turned them away. What they eventually uncovered, and how they uncovered it, forced Sussex Police to reopen a case they had closed and insisted was closed for good. Section 6. The Family's Fight. 6 years, £10,000 of life savings. Peter and Elizabeth Skelton were in their 80s when their daughter was found dead on her sofa. They had already lived through the grief of losing Susan. Now they were being told by every official body they approached that her death was an accident, that the man who had been hitting her 2 days before she died had simply rolled onto her in his sleep and that there was nothing more to look at. They did not believe it, and they did not stop. Peter Skelton went to Sussex Police in the period immediately after Susan's death and raised specific concerns about the circumstances. He was told his questions were valid but not significant. He was told it was a matter of opinion. The investigation would not be reopened. That was March 2011, less than a year after Susan died. The Skeltons were not going to accept that answer. They complained to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the body that exists specifically to hold police forces accountable when the public believes something has gone wrong. The IPCC told Sussex Police to look at the complaint again. Sussex Police looked at it again and came back with the same conclusion. In October 2012, an internal review by the force's own Professional Standards Department found that Trigg's links to Caroline Develin's unexplained death and his history of domestic violence gave cause to consider investigating further, and that the prospect of treating Trigg as a suspect had been discussed internally. The Skeltons were then told that same review had found no evidence of misconduct and that the matter had been properly investigated. The review that acknowledged there were reasons to look closer concluded that nothing had been done wrong. The Skeltons went back to the IPCC. They made a second appeal, then a third. In December 2014, after their third appeal, the police watchdog finally said that Sussex Police would at last conduct an adequate investigation of the complaint. At last. Those were the words used by the watchdog body tasked with oversight of police conduct in England and Wales. At last. 3 years after Susan died, after 3 separate appeals to the same body, the IPCC concluded that an adequate investigation had not yet happened. By 2015, the Skeltons had been pushing against institutional resistance for 4 years. They had complained to the force, to the IPCC, and had been turned away or told to wait at every stage. They made a decision. They would pay for the investigation themselves. Peter and Elizabeth Skelton, both in their 80s, spent £10,000 of their life savings. They hired lawyers. They commissioned an independent review of the post-mortem examinations of both Susan Nicholson and Caroline Develin by Dr. Nathaniel Carey, one of the most senior forensic pathologists in Britain, a man who had been involved in the Hillsborough inquiry. They paid for this out of their own retirement savings, because the police force that held a decade of records on the man who killed their daughter had decided 3 times that nothing had been done wrong. Dr. Carey reviewed the findings from both post-mortems. His conclusions were unambiguous. Susan Nicholson had not died because a man accidentally rolled onto her in his sleep. She had been suffocated. Her head had been deliberately pushed down into the surface beneath her, and she had also sustained a head injury. Caroline Develin had not died of a brain aneurysm. She had died as a result of a blow to the back of the head. 2 women, 2 post-mortems that had returned verdicts of natural causes or accident. 2 entirely different causes of death found by an independent expert working from the same evidence that had been available to Sussex Police all along. The Skeltons presented these findings to Sussex Police in 2016. The force reopened the investigation into Robert Trigg in June of that year. In November 2016, Trigg was questioned by police as a suspect for the first time. That was 10 years after he killed Caroline Develin and 5 years after he killed Susan Nicholson. A decade passed between his first murder and his first interview as a suspect. And that gap existed entirely because of institutional failure, not because the evidence was unavailable. Throughout those 6 years, the Skeltons described their treatment by Sussex Police in terms that are difficult to read. They said they were ignored. They said they were spoken down to. They were treated like a nuisance. It was implied, they said, that they were lying or that they were obsessive. 2 elderly people who had lost their daughter were told, repeatedly and in various ways, that their concerns were not worth taking seriously. Instead of the retirement years they had earned, they were spending their savings, hiring lawyers, and fighting a police force that had the information needed to convict Robert Trigg sitting in its own files. Susan's son Joe said at the time that he believed the police were responsible for his mother's death. He said Trigg would have killed again and again. He said the coroner should be investigating whether more could have been done to stop him. Caroline Develin's sister Anne said something simpler. She said, "If you had looked into it at the beginning, Caroline and Susan might still be here." That is not a complicated claim. It is not a legal argument or a procedural objection. It is a straightforward observation. A man with a documented history of violence killed one woman, and it was called natural causes. 5 years later, he killed another woman, and it was called an accident. Both times the same police force attended. Both times the same conclusion was reached. And 2 women's families spent years being told there was nothing to find. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What the trial revealed about the full extent of Trigg's violence and what happened inside that courtroom when the evidence was finally laid out in front of a jury is where the weight of everything in this case lands. Section 7. Trial, Conviction and Sentencing. Robert Trigg's trial was held at Lewes Crown Court. It lasted 10 days. Trigg denied any wrongdoing throughout. He had maintained the same position since the night Susan Nicholson was found dead on her sofa in 2011, that he had accidentally rolled onto her in his sleep, that he woke to find her unresponsive, that it was a tragedy he could not explain. He had told the same story about Caroline Develin 5 years before that he had found her unresponsive in bed, that he did not know what had happened, that he had simply woken up next to a dead woman. Twice. In the same town. 5 years apart. That was the account he was still giving when he sat in the dock at Lewes Crown Court in the summer of 2017. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the forensic evidence that the Skeltons had paid £10,000 of their own money to obtain. Dr. Nathaniel Carey, the independent pathologist whose review of both post-mortems had forced Sussex police to reopen the investigation, gave evidence at trial. His findings were clear and specific. Caroline Develin had died as a result of a blow to the back of the head. Susan Nicholson had been suffocated, her head pushed down deliberately into the surface beneath her, and she had also sustained a head injury. Neither death was consistent with the accounts Trigg had given. Neither death was an accident. The jury also heard about Trigg's behaviour in the immediate aftermath of both deaths. He had not called an ambulance either time. After Caroline died, he had left it to her children, including a 10-year-old, to call for help. After Susan died, he had called a neighbour, told her he thought Susan was dead, then walked out of the flat and went to a shop to buy cigarettes, before phoning his brother. In both cases, his first instinct was not to get help for the woman lying dead in front of him. The prosecution pointed to this as part of a pattern of behaviour. A man who knew what he had done and responded to it with a strange, deliberate calm, rather than panic. The court also heard evidence about Trigg's long history of violence and controlling behaviour towards women, his assault conviction, the call-outs to multiple addresses over multiple years, the reports made by 4 different women, the threat to kill a previous partner. All of it was laid out for the jury as evidence of who Robert Trigg was and how he behaved in intimate relationships. The picture that emerged was of a man who drank heavily, became violent when he drank, controlled the women he was with, and had left a trail of police reports and hospitalizations behind him stretching back nearly 2 decades. A representative from the Crown Prosecution Service made an observation after the verdict that cut through everything. They said it was extremely unlikely that 2 of Trigg's partners had died of natural causes while sharing a bed with him. That sentence, delivered in the dry, measured language of a legal professional, contains everything that should have been obvious from the moment Susan Nicholson was found dead in April 2011. The same man, 2 dead women, the same town, the same story. Extremely unlikely. That was the official assessment, delivered 6 years after the second death and 11 years after the first. On July 5, 2017, The jury returned its verdicts. Robert Trigg was found guilty of the murder of Susan Nicholson and the manslaughter of Caroline Develin. He was convicted on both counts after a 10-day trial that would never have taken place without an elderly couple spending their life savings to force a police force to do its job. The following day, July 6, 2017, Trigg was sentenced. Mrs. Justice Simler addressed him directly in court. She told him, "The grief and sadness of these two families will never leave them. These were senseless deaths, and nothing can now restore their lives, nor can any part of this sentencing process restore them either." Trigg was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years before he would be eligible to apply for parole. He will not be able to apply for release until he has served at least 25 years. Given his age at sentencing, that minimum term effectively means he will be an old man, if he is alive at all, before any parole board ever considers his case. As Trigg was led into court in handcuffs for sentencing, he spoke. He quoted a biblical verse, Isaiah 50, verse 11, and said, "They should be in here, not me." It was his final public statement about the deaths of two women he had killed. He was not expressing remorse. He was not acknowledging what he had done. He was pointing blame outward, at the families who had fought for justice, at the investigators who had finally done their jobs, at the system that had convicted him. They should be in here, not me. That was what Robert Trigg had to say on the day he was sentenced for killing Caroline Develin and Susan Nicholson. Sussex police issued a public apology after the conviction. They apologised to both families for not presenting all the facts to the Crown Prosecution Service following the original investigations. The Chief Constable visited Caroline Develin's sister, Anne, to apologise in person. Anne's response was direct. She told him, "It's a bit late for an apology. If you had looked into it at the beginning, Caroline and Susan might still be here." The force also said the families would be offered compensation and that independent inquiries into the handling of both cases would be carried out without fear or favour. The conviction was the end of the criminal case. It was not the end of the fight. What the inquest that followed revealed about the specific failures that allowed Robert Trigg to kill twice, and what it meant for the families who had been told for years there was nothing to find, is where the full institutional reckoning finally takes shape. Section 8. The 2021 inquest. Police failings officially confirmed. After Robert Trigg was convicted in July 2017, the High Court quashed the original inquest verdict into Susan Nicholson's death. The original verdict of accidental death could not stand alongside a criminal conviction for her murder. A new inquest was ordered. But what that new inquest would actually examine became its own battle. The senior coroner for West Sussex initially proposed to hold a short inquest, not a full examination of what had happened and why, just a brief proceeding to formally record that Susan had been unlawfully killed rather than accidentally. No examination of police conduct, no scrutiny of the decisions made in the weeks before her death. No questions put to the officers who had attended her flat 6 times and done nothing to stop what was happening there. Just a change of wording on the official record from accidental to unlawful, and then close the file. Peter and Elizabeth Skelton challenged that decision. They argued that a short inquest with no examination of police failings was not sufficient, that it breached Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to life and requires the state to conduct effective investigations into deaths that may involve state responsibility. Their legal team took the challenge to the High Court. In 2020, the High Court ruled in the Skeltons' favour. The case reference is R.V. Senior Coroner for West Sussex, 2020, EWHC 2813, Admin. The court agreed that a full Article 2 inquest was required, one that would look properly at what the police knew, what they did, and what they failed to do. The coroner's decision to limit the scope of the inquest was overturned. A full inquest would be held. It is worth pausing on what that legal challenge required of two people who were, by this point, well into their 80s. They had already spent 6 years and £10,000 of their savings forcing a criminal investigation. They had already fought the Independent Police Complaints Commission 3 times. They had already sat through a 10-day murder trial, and now they were fighting in the High Court for the right to have a proper inquest into how their daughter died, against a coroner who did not want to hold one, and a police force that had previously threatened to pursue them for legal costs if their earlier challenges failed. The full inquest was held at West Sussex Coroner's Court in Crawley in the summer of 2021, a decade after Susan Nicholson was found dead on her sofa. The jury heard evidence across a fortnight. They examined what Sussex police knew about Robert Trigg's history of violence before Susan's death. They examined how officers had handled the 6 call-outs to her flat in the months before she was killed. They examined the decisions made after Caroline Develin's death in 2006, including the decision not to commission a Home Office pathologist, and the decision to record that death as natural causes without further investigation. They heard from witnesses, from officers, from family members, and from legal representatives for all parties. The jury's conclusions were delivered on July 5, 2021, exactly 4 years to the day after Trigg had been convicted at Lewes Crown Court. Those conclusions were unambiguous and specific. The jury found that Sussex police knew, or ought reasonably to have known, that Robert Trigg posed a real and immediate risk to Susan Nicholson's life. They found that Sussex police did not take such measures as could reasonably be expected of them to protect her. They found that this failure caused or contributed to her death. In plain terms, a jury concluded that Susan Nicholson died, at least in part, because Sussex police did not do what they should have done. The jury also found that the decision to declare Caroline Develin's death unexplained and the failure to launch a homicide investigation into her death in 2006 was a significant failure. They found there was a realistic possibility that Susan Nicholson's death may have been prevented if Caroline Develin's death had been properly declared and investigated as suspicious. If the officers who attended Cranworth Road in March 2006 had treated that scene as a potential homicide, if a Home Office pathologist had been called, if Robert Trigg had been investigated as a suspect after Caroline's death, there is a realistic possibility that Susan Nicholson would still be alive. That is not a campaigner's claim or a family's grief finding an outlet. That is the finding of a jury at a formal legal inquest. The jury was also asked about the decision by the pathologist, working under instruction from the coroner, not to refer Caroline Develin's death to a Home Office forensic pathologist when the original examination could not locate the site of a ruptured aneurysm. They found that this too was a significant failure, and that it contributed to the chain of events that ended with Susan Nicholson's death. Following the inquest verdict, Assistant Chief Constable Fiona Macpherson issued a formal apology on behalf of Sussex Police. She apologised for the failings of the force in relation to the deaths of both Caroline Develin and Susan Nicholson. That apology came 10 years after Susan died, 15 years after Caroline died, and only after the Skeltons had fought through every available legal avenue to get to that moment. In February 2018, before the inquest had even begun, Thames Valley Police had completed an independent review of Sussex Police's handling of both investigations, and concluded that the force had missed opportunities. That review was referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the successor body to the IPCC. A separate domestic homicide review was also launched by the Safer West Sussex Partnership. Multiple bodies, multiple reviews, all reaching versions of the same conclusion. Opportunities were missed. Failures occurred. A woman died who did not have to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What those failures left behind in the lives of the people who survived them, and what this case ultimately changed about how domestic violence is meant to be handled in Britain, is the final part of this story. Section 9. What Trigg did after getting away with it. Between April 2011, when Susan Nicholson was found dead on her sofa, and July 2017, when Robert Trigg was finally convicted, 6 years passed. During those 6 years, Trigg was not in custody. He was not under investigation. He was not being monitored or supervised. He was living freely in Worthing, the same town where he had killed 2 women, treated by the official record as a man who had suffered 2 tragic losses, rather than a man who had committed 2 murders. And in those 6 years, he continued to do what he had always done. In October 2014, 3 years after Susan's death, Trigg began a relationship with a woman named Deirdre Loveridge. The relationship deteriorated, as his relationships always did. When it broke down, Trigg's response was to send Loveridge more than 100 abusive messages and phone calls. Over 100. Loveridge reported him to police. This time, unlike the repeated reports made about his behaviour towards previous partners over the previous decade, the matter was actually prosecuted. Trigg was convicted of harassment and given a restraining order. A restraining order is a civil order that prohibits contact. It is the legal system's way of telling someone to stay away. It carries no prison sentence on its own. For a man who had by that point killed 2 women, sent a woman to hospital for 3 weeks, been reported by 4 different partners, and been cautioned for punching Susan Nicholson in the face 2 days before her death, the consequence for his behaviour towards Deirdre Loveridge was a restraining order and a harassment conviction. The fact that Trigg was convicted of harassment in 2014 is significant beyond simply illustrating that he continued to be violent after Susan's death. It is significant because it happened while the Skeltons were actively trying to convince Sussex police to reopen the investigation into their daughter's murder. While Peter and Elizabeth Skelton were appealing to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, spending their savings and being told repeatedly that there was nothing to find, the man they were trying to get investigated was adding another conviction to a record that already documented years of violence against women. The system that kept telling the Skeltons to go away was simultaneously processing a new case of abusive behaviour by the man at the centre of their complaint. There is also the matter of what Trigg did publicly after Susan's death. He sold his story to a magazine. The amount he received was not disclosed, but the fact of the sale is documented. In that interview, Trigg reiterated his claim that Susan's death was accidental, that he had rolled onto her in his sleep. He presented himself as a grieving partner who had suffered a terrible loss. While the Skeltons were fighting to be taken seriously, while they were spending their life savings to prove their daughter had been murdered, the man who killed her was being given a public platform to repeat the account that police had accepted and that a coroner had recorded as the official version of events. He was not in hiding. He was not keeping a low profile. He was telling his story to a magazine. After his conviction for harassment and the restraining order involving Loveridge, Trigg remained in Worthing. The Skeltons were, by this point, beginning to get traction with their campaign, having finally secured a commitment from the IPCC that an adequate investigation would be conducted. But between that commitment in late 2014 and the actual reopening of the investigation in June 2016, another 18 months passed. Trigg was questioned as a suspect for the first time in November 2016. He was charged in December of that year. From the night Susan Nicholson died to the moment Robert Trigg was first formally treated as a suspect, 5 years and 7 months had elapsed. The Centre for Women's Justice, which has documented this case extensively as part of its work on police responses to domestic abuse, has noted the broader pattern that the Trigg case represents. Domestic abuse specialist units within police forces across England and Wales had been significantly reduced under austerity measures during the years when Susan Nicholson was being repeatedly beaten and when the Skeltons were fighting to have her death investigated. Many specialist units had been disbanded entirely. Others were so small that most survivors of domestic abuse had no meaningful contact with them at all. Sussex Police's Specialist Domestic Violence Unit was the very unit that should have received a referral when Susan's risk was graded as medium following the visit where officers found her with 2 black eyes a swollen nose and mouth, and bruising across her chest. That referral never happened because someone downgraded her risk assessment to standard with no recorded reason. The unit that existed specifically to intervene in cases like Susan's never knew her case existed. Susan's son Joe spoke publicly about what those years did to him. He said that Trigg would have killed again and again. He described the period between his mother's death and the conviction as one that knocked his life sideways through his 20s. He was in his 20s when his mother died, told it was an accident, and spent the years that followed watching his grandparents fight a police force that kept telling them to accept a verdict the family knew was wrong. His brother Mark was in the same position. Two young men who lost their mother to a man with a decade of documented violence behind him, and then spent years being managed and dismissed by the institutions that were supposed to give them answers. Caroline Develin's children carried a parallel weight. Her son, Brandon McKenna, was 9 years old when he woke up on Mother's Day 2006 and found his mother dead. He grew up knowing that Trigg had been in the house that morning, that his mother's death had been called natural causes, and that the man who killed her had walked free. By the time Trigg was convicted in 2017, Brandon was in his early 20s. He said the verdict confirmed that Sussex police had closed the case into his mother's murder far too early, and that Robert Trigg had gone on to murder Susan Nicholson as a direct result. What all of this left behind, in the permanent damage done to the people who survived it, and in the changes it eventually forced on how domestic violence cases are meant to be handled, is where this case finally comes to rest. Section 10. The Permanent Scar. What was left behind? Robert Trigg is currently serving a life sentence at a prison in England, with a minimum term of 25 years. He will not be eligible to apply for parole until he has served that minimum. Given that he was sentenced in July 2017, he cannot apply for parole consideration until at minimum 2042. He was born around 1966, which means he will be in his mid-70s before a parole board ever looks at his case, if he is alive at that point at all. The two women he killed were 35 and 52 years old when he murdered them. Caroline Develin's 4 children grew up without a mother. Susan Nicholson's 2 sons lost theirs in the same way. None of them had any say in it. None of them were warned. None of them were protected. Peter and Elizabeth Skelton, Susan's parents, were described in court documents and press coverage as being in their 80s throughout the period of their legal campaign. They spent more than a decade fighting. They spent £10,000 of their life savings. They complained to Sussex Police, to the Independent Police Complaints Commission 3 separate times, to the High Court, and to the Coroner's Office. They were threatened with legal costs by Sussex Police if their High Court challenge failed. They were told they were being obsessive. They were implied to be liars. They were managed, delayed, and dismissed by almost every institution they approached, for years, before anyone in an official position acknowledged what they had known since the morning their daughter was found dead. In their statement after the 2021 inquest verdict, the Skeltons said, "We did not know then the history of awful violence perpetrated by Trigg against Susan and other women, or about the death of his previous partner, Caroline Develin. Sussex Police did know. It has been agony for us to learn about what Susan went through prior to her death, and the extent of the failings to protect her from him." They added that instead of enjoying their retirement years, they had suffered mental torture for over a decade fighting to get justice for Susan. That is what the institutional failure in this case cost 2 elderly people personally. Not just grief, which would have been unavoidable regardless, but a decade of mental torture layered on top of grief, spent fighting the very bodies that should have been fighting alongside them from the start. Caroline Develin's family carried a version of the same weight across a longer period. Caroline was killed in 2006. Her sister Anne said that their mother, by the time of the 2021 inquest verdict, was 77 years old and had been crushed emotionally, both by Caroline's murder and by the way police had handled everything that followed. Anne said she could only assume the explanation for the police's conduct lay somewhere between laziness and corruption. She said she sincerely hoped lessons would be learned because she could not bear it happening to anyone else. Caroline's son Brandon, who was 9 when he found his mother dead on Mother's Day, said he wanted to do his mother proud and follow a career caring for others, because that had been her ambition too. He lost her when he was 9 years old. He found out years later that she had been murdered. He spent his childhood and his teenage years and his early 20s in the shadow of something that had been called natural causes, and then eventually, after his generation of the family had already grown up without her, reclassified as manslaughter. Sussex police issued a formal apology after Trigg's conviction in 2017. The force said it was truly sorry it had taken so long to get justice, and that it was important to learn lessons and provide answers for the families. After the 2021 inquest verdict, Assistant Chief Constable Fiona McPherson issued a further apology, specifically for the failings of the force in relation to the deaths of both Caroline Develin and Susan Nicholson. 2 apologies, delivered years apart, both after the families had been forced to drag the truth out of the institution through legal challenges funded from their own pockets. An apology issued after a decade of obstruction and dismissal is not absolution. It is an acknowledgement that the harm was real, delivered long after the harm was already done, and could not be undone. The independent review conducted by Thames Valley Police in February 2018 concluded that Sussex Police had missed opportunities when investigating the deaths of both women. That review was referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. A domestic homicide review was carried out by the Safer West Sussex Partnership. Multiple investigations into the investigation, all reaching the same broad conclusion in different formal language. Missed opportunities, significant failures, realistic possibility of prevention. These are the phrases that appear across the official findings, each one a carefully worded acknowledgement that Susan Nicholson and Caroline Develin did not have to die. The case is now used by organisations including the Centre for Women's Justice as an example of what chronic under-resourcing and inadequate training in domestic abuse policing looks like in practice. The centre has documented how specialist domestic abuse units were stripped back under austerity during the years when Susan was being beaten and her family were being turned away. The Trigg case sits within a wider pattern of women being failed by a system that had the tools to protect them and chose, through a combination of budget decisions, institutional indifference, and individual failures to join the dots, not to use them. Susan Nicholson was a 52-year-old mother of 2 who had built a career, raised her sons, and walked into a rehabilitation centre in July 2010 looking to get better. She met a man there. She trusted him. She let him move into her home. She called the police, or her neighbours called on her behalf, 6 times in the months that followed. Each call was a request for help. Each one was answered with the minimum possible response, and then filed away. On April 17, 2011, the calls stopped. Not because the danger had passed, because Susan was gone. Robert Trigg is in prison. The minimum term means he stays there until at least 2042. But Caroline Develin's children will never have their mother back for the years they already lost. Susan's sons will never have the version of their 20s that existed before April 2011. Peter and Elizabeth Skelton spent their retirement fighting a police force that should have been fighting for their daughter. That is what was left behind. Not just 2 deaths, but everything those deaths took with them, and everything that was then spent trying to get someone, anyone, to admit that it did not have to happen this way. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.